So, good day everyone. We are the Group 3 and we will discuss the 5 genetic mechanisms and the definition of species according to the biological species concept. So, good day everyone. We are the Group 3 and we will discuss the 5 genetic mechanisms and the definition of species according to the biological species concept. Let's go!
When we say non-random mating, it is when breeders select mates based on their desired traits to increase the frequency of those traits that they want to pass to their offspring or to the next generations. So there are 2 types of non-random mating. Number 1 is disassortative and the second one is inbreeding. When we say disassortative, it is mating between species with different phenotype and genotype, while inbreeding is mating between species with the same phenotype and genotype, or in short, species mate with their relatives. Quick recap, when we say non-random mating, it is when breeders select mates based on their desired traits to increase the frequency of those traits to the next generations. Is one example of this assortative. So we can see here that this butterfly is a homozygous dominant while the other one is heterozygous. So we have said that this assortative is mating between species with different phenotype and genotype. So this is one example of it. A homozygous dominant butterfly mates with a heterozygous dominant which has a different genotype and phenotype. Example of inbreeding. So we can see that there are 2 butterflies with the same genotype and phenotype. So we have said that in inbreeding, it is mating between species with the same phenotype and genotype. So in my example, it is when homozygous dominant butterfly mates with another homozygous dominant. So that is an example of inbreeding.
For the second genetic mechanism is mutation. Mutation is defined as any change in the DNA causes change in the phenotype or in the appearance of an organism. Meaning when the DNA changes, the phenotype also changes, or the appearance of the organism will change. So for example, if we have a flower and its phenotype is color pink, and when you change its genotype, its phenotype will turn into color red.
Unlike natural selection wherein they choose which trait is most fit to reproduce in accordance to the environment, genetic drift chooses by random chance. Here we have our different pigs with different genotypes, whether it be dominant or recessive. All of these has equal possibilities of being passed on to the next generation by complete random chance. There are two types of genetic drift that can cause extreme reduction in population. One of which is bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect is caused by a major disaster that kills off majority of the population. Thus, only handful survives. An example of bottleneck effect is bears living in the mountains. For example, there are white bears and there are brown bears and there are black bears living in the mountain. And for some reason, the landslide only hits the white and the brown bears, with only the black bear surviving. Because only the black bear survive, there will be a major reduction on the population as well as the variation. The second type is the founder effect. The founder effect happens when a few of the population is isolated from the rest. An example would be a flock of birds migrating to some place, and by random chance the bluebirds got lost and had to migrate somewhere else. They will then make a new population there where they are settled, and since the whole flock of birds are gone, there will also be a major reduction in population and variation.
So gene flow or gene migration is basically result of movement of an individual. They say humans move freely around the world. That is why it resulted different kinds of phenotypes. So basically, gene flow is contribution of one individual allele to a population is therefore what gene flow is.
So for our second question that was assigned to us is define the species according to the biological species concept. So, for us to further explain the definition of the species according to the biological species concept, first we must discuss the definition of species. Definition of species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. When we hear the word interbreed, it means that producing offspring with each other, while fertile offspring means that the offspring of parents can continue to reproduce, which means that the offspring which has produced by the parents can also produce another offspring. So that is the definition of species. Since species has a lot of ways to determine, we need to classify them on what species is all about. So the question for our topic for today is, how do we classify species? So there are two classifications. Two classifications of species. First, we have the different species, and the same species. So, we will discuss further first the different species. So, different species different species is two organisms that produces offspring but not viable and infertile offspring. So, different species is two organisms that produces offspring but not viable and it is not a fertile offspring, which means that two organisms can produce an offspring but the offspring is not viable and it is infertile. Infertile means that the offspring cannot produce another offspring. For example, there are two parents which are the lion and the tiger. A lion is a species and a tiger is a species also. But both of them can actually interbreed with each other. But because of this, they are both different species. So let's say that there is a male lion and a female tiger. Both of them can interbreed. So when a lion and a tiger interbreed with each other, their offspring will be a liger, which is a half lion and a half tiger. So a liger cannot be called a member of a species. So ligers are not species, but they are called to be a hybrid. So hybrid is an offspring resulting from the cross breeding of two distinct species. So a hybrid is an offspring resulting from the crossbreeding of two distinct species, just like the example of the lion and the tiger. the lion and the tiger are two different or distinct species. So as they interbreed with each other, it created a liger. So for us to determine that it is a different species is a different species is not how two species have the similarities of the appearance and the behavior. All of two parents is the donkey and the horse. So a donkey and a horse have similarities on appearances and behaviors, but once they interbreed with each other, they are both now a different species. Let's say there is a male donkey and a female horse. When both of them interbreed with each other, it will create an offspring which is a mule. A mule is a half donkey and a half horse. But just like the liger on the first example, we will not call it as a species, but instead we will call it as a hybrid. So it is the same as the liger. So because the donkey and the horse are different species, and because they are a different species, they may interbreed with each other and create an offspring, but that offspring cannot reproduce again an offspring, which makes them called a hybrid. So a hybrid is the crossbreeding of two different species or two distinct species. So what if let's say that it is a female donkey and a male horse. Their offspring is very different from the mule. Instead, it is a mule, it is called a hinny, which is a half horse and a half donkey. So, a hinny and a mule are very different with each other. They're very different, but they have the same parents, the same species of parents. So both of them is also called a hybrid. Since the definition a while ago about species must be that the organisms must produce a fertile offspring, which means that the offspring must reproduce another offspring. It means that different species cannot classify as the species. So let's go on to the definition of the same species. So, same species are two organisms that can interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. So, same species are two organisms that can interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring. Unlike the different species cannot be viable and it is infertile offspring. While the same species, the offspring can reproduce another offspring. So which means that the same species can produce viable and fertile offspring. So, to further understand this, we will have an example. First example is the dogs. Dogs can have different breeds. So, dogs have different breeds, which means that it has different behaviors and different appearances. For example, dogs can be small or tall. Dogs can be white or black, and other certain examples that makes them different from each other. But even though they look different and act different, because they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, we can consider as dogs as a member of same species. Because, for example, a poodle and an Ascal, both of them has the different appearances and the different behavior. But even though they are both different, but as they relate to each other, they may interbreed a fertile offspring. Which is why dogs can be classified as a same species. So, another example to further understand this is humans. Humans have different skin color, different height, and they're both different and they have the both different behavior. But humans can interbreed with other humans and they can still produce a fertile offspring. For example, an American and a Filipino, even though they are both different, they can still interbreed and produce fertile offspring, which makes humans a same species. So, because of the same species, we can now define species according to the biological species concept. We can define species according to the biological species concept. So, species or biological species are a group of the same species that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Haba pa. It is not based similarity of appearance but on how they relate to each other. So, species are a group of the same species that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but it is not based on the similarity of the appearance, but is on how they relate to each other. So that is the definition of the biological species concept. So for us to really understand, I'll make a shortcut on the terms so that we will further know the definition of it. So, species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And it is not based on the similarity of appearance, but it is how they relate to each other. So that is the definition of species. Thank you. Because of the definition of species according to the biological species concept, this gives an explanation of how species form speciation. Speciation is a process by which new species form. It occurs when groups in a species become reproductively isolated and diverge. So, speciation is a process by which new species form, and it occurs when groups in a species become reproductively isolated and diverge. So, speciation is a process which creates a new form of species. So, it is an example of the different species that we discussed earlier. So, for us to know further the differences and the whereabouts on why different species happen, it will be discussed by the group 4.